Welcome on into Forward Progress presented by Fanduel Sportsbook. I'm your host, Eric Pauly, with our usual panel of Suma, Judah, and TA of CleveAnalytics.com. We have a lot to discuss this week. Of course, we start the show by always discussing some key takeaways from Week 9, but also the trade deadline in the NFL is tomorrow. So we expect there to be some action. So we're going to talk about some trade candidates and maybe some teams to take a look at in the futures market to get ahead of some news in the trade deadline, whether that be to buy a team now before they make a deal or sell a team that could be selling off. Of course, then going into some Week 10 look-ahead lines and finishing up with a Monday Night Football breakdown, finalized with a same-game parlay cooked up by Judah. Tons of fun, great show. Everybody here, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and we appreciate any and all comments. We'll definitely get to as many of them as possible. But without further ado, let's talk about Week 9. A lot to take away. It was a massive week for the chalk on the money line this week. It's a lot of favorites won. But two particular juggernauts in the NFL at this point are the Detroit Lions and the Baltimore Ravens, who once again flexed their muscles in, situations. Baltimore with a less good opponent, while the Lions, of course, beating up on the Packers. But TA, talk to me about what you saw from Detroit and Baltimore and how nervous the rest of the NFL should be about these two teams, because they're absolute wagons right now.
Yeah, I mean, both had kind of interesting matchups in terms of Baltimore facing Denver's defense, which had been getting a lot of hype and playing very well, but obviously they had faced a much easier set of opponents, a pretty soft schedule. So there was some question as to, is who's going to win out this Baltimore offense or the Denver defense. And it was clear from the beginning that Baltimore's offense is just a wagon and it doesn't matter who's in front of them. They just destroyed and decimated this Denver defense, which I still think is pretty good, but it's not nearly to the level I think that they had been playing. So, they just romped all over them. And it's now between, if you consider the two best defenses on their schedule, Kansas City and Denver, they've, generated by far the best EPA, the highest EPA that either of those defenses allowed all season in those single games. And then on the other side, you had Detroit, which this is probably their toughest test, outdoors and all that, the narrative talk with Goff, which, that first pass he threw over the middle to, I think it was to Laporta, right away, the announcers thought the ball was tipped at the line. It came out like such a duck and he completed it. And then you watch the replay and it didn't hit anybody. It was just, that's how it came out of his hand. So he thought maybe like the conditions were going to really affect him, but they just didn't need him really all that much. Everything he was throwing was pretty short. He was accurate in doing so, but they just ran all over Green Bay, and Jordan Love was clearly hobbled. He couldn't move much and just made that terrible pick six, and they got stopped. The Lions made key stops, and so they kind of, that was the one big hurdle that was their way, is that every game had been indoors, and this was going to be their test to really see if they can do it in tough, maybe playoff like conditions, and they passed that test. So pretty impressive, I think, on both fronts for both of those teams. It essentially proved that they're, however you want to put those three with them two in Kansas City, I guess realistically, Detroit and Baltimore are going to be higher rated than Kansas City in the market, but you got the Mahomes factor and just how good that, I'm not sure it matters the rating. So it's going to be interesting, if Baltimore and Kansas City do meet up in the playoffs again, especially in Kansas City, how that gets bet and how that gets rated. But I think it just proved yesterday that both of those, it's kind of a collision course potentially for a Super Bowl.
Certainly, it would be a fun Super Bowl. And two teams that we also noted that obviously their offenses are incredible, but are somewhat have liabilities defensively. So we'll see how that plans out deeper into the season with these two teams in the NFL, of course, now being a very offensive-driven league, of course, seeing if these two defenses maybe get in the way of the potential matchup between these two juggernauts in the Super Bowl. But let's move on to some two teams who one of them is definitely not playing in Super Bowl. That's the Chicago Bears, who fall to Arizona. Another just ugly loss. Some just coaching. The team clearly has bought into absolutely nothing. Going to the road against a poor Arizona defense and Arizona pass rush, at least by name. But of course, they play well together, and the Bears were unable to, beat the Cardinals and fall to 0-17 on Sundays on the road under their current head coach, which is absolutely absurd. Then you have the Houston Texans, who on Thursday night played a Jets defensive line that we've talked about. We expect them to be better. We're not playing so great all year, but then they absolutely were able to dominate this Texas offensive line and sack Stroud and get him out of field goal range in a couple different possessions. But you had talked to me about the collapse of these two offensive lines and the status of these two teams moving forward and what you noticed from Sunday and how you think that could work for these teams moving forward.
Yeah. So I think it's always hard to know in football whether, an offensive line may take a stat like pressure rate. And that's, I think, kind of the result is ultimately what matters insofar as we're predicting like what's going to happen next week because these players are not going anywhere. These teams are not changing so much. And the Texans over the last 3 weeks have allowed a 47% pressure rate, by far the highest in the NFL. The Bears are not far behind at 42%. And mind you, like the Bears are playing I think the Washington pass rush is certainly underrated, but they're playing an Arizona pass rush, which was dead last in many pass rush categories entering this game. They had 14 different guys get a pressure. The Texans had the Colts, who were a bottom 5 pass rush, destroy them. It wasn't just the Jets. And both of these teams are allowing pressure on like 45% of their plays over the last couple of games. And certainly they're dealing with injuries, but that's not changing anytime soon. And it's really hard to have sustained success on offense when you're allowing a 45% pressure rate. I think for Caleb Williams in particular, we're getting some very valuable data on the situation he needs for him to be successful. He takes a ton of sacks when he's under pressure, and he's creating a lot of zone pressure. His time to throw in the first 4 or 5 weeks of the season was somewhere around 2.6 to 2.8. That's jumped up to 3.1 to 3.4 over the last bunch of weeks. And as a result, he's taken a ton of sacks, and there's been some kind of high ceiling games like that, the game in London. But there's also kind of that left tail game like we saw against the Cardinals. I think he's going to be a pretty volatile player, and I think he's going to be reliant a bit more on his offensive line than I think kind of the initial draft expectations, which was a guy who can create so much on his own. And we certainly see a lot of those highlight reel plays. Even the play we were talking about with DJ Moore quitting, he did a terrific job of extending that play and actually getting an open throw there, even if it was incomplete. All that is to say, I think that Caleb Williams is holding the ball for a bit too long right now. There's probably some indecision happening, and I think he's pretty reliant on his offensive line. And CJ Stroud right now, he's just not going to have success if he's being pressured on 48% of his dropbacks. I think this is a Titans offense that badly needs Nico Collins healthy, and as of right now, I think is way overpriced given the state of the offensive line and just generally their offensive production without Nico Collins.
Yeah, definitely something to note there. And also, like you said, the injuries for the wide receivers are obviously not going to help. But then when you have no protection up front for CJ Stroud, it's going to make life so much more difficult. Suma, you had thoughts on these two teams and their offensive line productions and just them in general as well. Tell me how you viewed these two teams' offensive lines as well as in general based on their performances this past week and what you expect moving forward.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Judah said. The Texans, it's a recurring theme like all season long. They have a very low success rate. They cannot move the ball on early downs. No wide receiver help. And we always said most likely a Bobby Slovic thing. And now their pass protection is completely collapsing. And to be honest, Nico Collins might be back this week. D'Amico Ryans just said we will see where he is later in the week, so probably not 100% guaranteed. And I'm just not sure what the easy solution to that state of the Texans offense is right now, to be honest. And the Bears, they might just be a complete mess despite having 4 wins under their belt. But I think in hindsight, the teams they beat, we might just adjust for those opponents a little bit more. Offensive line is a mess. Shane Walden is probably a mess. Sometimes I don't watch all 22, but sometimes you see extended reviews of some plays, and it doesn't really feel like that offense is playing with a plan, with a concrete structure, with trying to scheme guys open. It's basically line up and see what happens. And I don't think that is a winning strategy in today's NFL. And the defense has been really good when everyone is healthy, but it seems like it's extremely fragile. As soon as there are some guys missing, I think half their secondary was out at some point yesterday. Montez Sweat was inactive, and the Cardinals had whatever they wanted in the running game. And I think if you're able to run so consistently on a defense that also leaves like a more sour taste in your mouth than if you just got beaten through the air, I guess. So I can only imagine that the vibes at Soldier Field are not good right now. Joey K tweeted today that he likes Matt Eberflus to be the next head coach fired at 25-1. Granted, I think at Bet Online that was probably like a, I don't know, $50 limit market, but I don't hate that look at all. I think if they have a bad game against the Pats this week, we will see what happens.
Yeah, certainly stuff to think about there for the Chicago Bears. I know the Bears are kind of old school, so they're not a team that's known to make moves during the season. But that being said, the way that Eberflus has been running this team, it's not a small sample by any means that he should certainly be on the block, because you have, obviously some bonehead decisions they've made throughout the course of the season, and clearly guys looking like they're giving up in that locker room for a team that, a couple of weeks ago we're talking about how the the NFC North is best division in football. Everybody is, over 500, looking great, but that is something to note for the Bears moving forward. But let's go to an NFC East matchup from this past weekend. The Washington Commanders head to MetLife Field and get the win against the Giants. I was actually in attendance for that game, so obviously had a good look of what was going on, but I'm going to be basing some of my takes off of just the eye test that I haven't dove in. But what I saw, Suma, and this goes well with what you prefaced in our chat about what you want to talk about, my word of the day for the Commanders yesterday was everything on offense just seemed effortless. The Giants were struggling or, moving the ball. They moved it down the field. They were able to, put together a good drive, get a score. And then Jaden Daniels comes out onto the field. They move the ball effortlessly and score. Yes, they did have a few punts, but that was kind of how I saw it. Suma, talk to us about this Kliff Kingsbury scheme, Jaden Daniels, and what you saw from, watching, and I'm sure looking at more of the advanced numbers there. Was it as effortless as it really looked? Because it looked like really easy just for this offense to get whatever they wanted.
That was exactly my talking point. This is Dan Quinn as an head coach. This is a team with one of the lowest win totals going into the season. Rookie quarterback. Everyone thought this is going to be a mess coaching staff. Roster is not there. And now we are in week 9. They are laying, I think the closing line was -4 on the road. And it just seems effortless. Like, almost at no point during the game, you had the feeling that they would lose this game. It also didn't feel like you saw too many highlight plays, but they just dropped a casual 54% success rate, 0.32 EPA per play. It just felt casually effortless. Kliff Kingsbury take a bow. I mean, this is absolutely amazing. Like, it feels like Jaden Daniels always has the correct first read, and when he does not get to his first read, there are very few defensive players who can actually outrun this guy. So pretty amazing offense to watch. And I think also there was one situation, I think late fourth quarter, the Commanders had the ball and they needed, I think, 3 first downs. I don't remember correctly. And it was 2nd and 9, and Brian Dable did not take a timeout, and it was going towards the 2-minute warning. That means the Commanders can throw the ball because the clock will stop automatically. So they don't need to call a run to keep the clock moving. And Dable did not take a timeout for whatever reason. And Kliff Kingsbury dialed up a 42-yard pass down the field to Olamide Zaccheaus. Absolutely bananas. Great stuff. Risk-taking. They are not afraid to take risk. That's really something that you like to see from such team. And yeah, amazing. I mean, Judah talks about them every week, every Wednesday. They have one of the best, maybe the best offense after the Ravens in the league right now with a rookie quarterback. And it's not like they have too many elite players outside of the quarterback position. And yeah, that's pretty dope. I think Kingsbury is doing a phenomenal job.
Certainly doing a great job. A marriage that I hope lasts in DC as Kingsbury. I'm sure he'll be getting looks to be a head coach. But some guys, this could be another topic of discussion for a different show at a different time. Maybe some guys are just meant to be coordinators, and the team should start paying coordinators head coach money just to stick and do what they know what they can do. Obviously, Kingsbury has head coaching experience, etc. But like we just both mentioned there, Suma, it looked effortless at times. The Giants put together like a 16-play scoring drive. Daniels gets on the field, and they just move the football like it's nothing. And it was fun. And I wanted some smoke from Giants fans. I was trying to chirp a little bit, and I just couldn't get it out of them. They were like, yeah, we know our team stinks. And seeing my team, though, get a win was always fun. But we had and also finally, before I get to the next point, Dan Quinn is doing his presser, I think, as we speak. And there were a bunch of reports coming into this weekend about how the Commanders are looking to be active at the deadline. Of course, we will be discussing some deadline. I don't know how much of that is smoke, how much of that is valid, but I guess we will be finding out within the next 24 hours. So definitely keep our minds, our ears and eyes open to see if Washington is going to be buyers, as they do have some needs, like you mentioned. But the quarterback's been elevating this entire team. But Dennis Allen finally gets fired from New Orleans. This was a long time coming. As we know, the Saints in general, in terms of salary cap, et cetera, have been behind the eight ball for a while, kind of holding on to this, I guess, belief that they are better than they are and are truly contenders, when unfortunately that hasn't been the case, especially when you have one of the worst head coaches of not just this past 5 years, 10 years, et cetera, in the history of the NFL running the team, but is finally no longer the head coach. T.I., talk to us more about this Dennis Allen firing, what you expect from the Saints moving forward, and some of the metrics that I know that you have from that amazing database you have at your website from Dennis Allen as a head coach in the NFL.
Yeah, I mean, not too controversial that he was a pretty terrible head coach for the most part, at least relative to expectations. I mean, 38% against the spread with the Saints. I think he was just as bad. I haven't looked up his Raider numbers, but I know he was just as bad there. Pretty bad as a favorite. I think 7-13 against the spread with New Orleans. And, you know, probably the best bet on the board every year is backing Andy Reid and the Chiefs from a win total perspective, and then fading Dennis Allen, whoever he's coaching. And this is going to be 6 years, all 6 years that he's been a head coach, that he's going to go under. Their team's going to go under their win total. So, you know, he just, every single season plays down to expectations. And, you know, you could blame the injuries. You know, maybe they started off hot and then, you know, started to deal with those injuries and collapse. And, you know, that could be a big part of it. But when he's got control over specific situations, and he's got the ability to, create added win probability like he did yesterday, he refuses to take it. And I think the final nail in the coffin was, you know, you're up 5 against a bad Carolina team. You're running up and down the field on them. You know, they cannot stop anybody. Alvin Kamara had 155 yards. Taysom Hill, can get any short yardage situation he wants. They were 4th and less than 1 at about the 46-yard line with like 5 minutes left. And instead of, you know, just doing a quarterback sneak, they decided to take a delay of game on purpose, try to draw them off sides, and then they punted. And that was just, and Carolina comes down and scores. You know, it was just one of the worst decisions you'll ever see. And that was just epitomized the Dennis Allen era. And so I think that was, you know, the final nail in the coffin there. So he should never be a head coach again. I mean, he's probably a solid defensive coordinator. Like he's going to be one of those guys that can be a good defensive coach, and he'll probably get a job next year pretty easily. But, you know, he's not head coaching material. So I don't know. I mean, going forward this year, you know, the cap situation is so bad in New Orleans. Maybe they'll sell off some pieces and pick up some draft picks, but I'm not really sure. You know, they've got a really easy schedule. They've all season, and it hasn't mattered. So with the injuries and Olave, who's likely going to be out, you know, who knows with this, what is this, 5th concussion? I mean, it looked pretty bad. I don't know if there's any upside here at all with the Saints, but maybe they get the post head coach fire bump. I haven't even looked at the market recently to see if the line has moved. I know it was 3.5 at home against Atlanta, but you know, maybe they get a little bit of a bump there. But otherwise, I don't see too much here going forward.
Yeah, like you mentioned there, T.I., Dennis Allen might fit that mold of a guy who, again, I don't know if he specifically deserves head coach money just to be a DC, but he is good at coordinating defense. Just coordinate defense. Don't need to take that leap of faith to be the head coach. Obviously, there's ego, cash, et cetera, involved to, you know, tell somebody not to make said leap. But 2 tries as a head coach for Dennis Allen, 2 massive fails. But the defense has looked good at times, and he can coordinate defense. So, like you said, he probably will get a job. But let's talk about a defense that has punched a little bit above their weight class, especially considering who they have from a name perspective on their team. And also just got active in the trade deadline about an hour ago. The Arizona Cardinals trade for Baron Browning from the Denver Broncos for a 6th-round draft pick, so adding to their defense to help of course, strengthen this team that has a winning record. There's a lot of talk in the offseason about if the Cardinals team was going to really elevate from last year, or I guess how much they were going to elevate with now Kyler Murray being healthy, year 2 of the Gannon system, and see if these things can come together. So yeah, I know you're very, very in tune with the Arizona Cardinals. You were very impressed by the coaching of this team because, again, names on the back of the jerseys are not pretty for Arizona, but they're playing good football. Talk to us about what you're seeing from the Cardinals.
Yeah, I mean, I just floated the question in our Slack that, is Arizona for real? And I don't even have an answer because I'm not really sure. I mean, if you look at some of their defensive metrics, I mean, they're pretty bad, but they've also faced, a ridiculously impossible set of offenses and quarterbacks. I mean, when you're talking about Buffalo and the Rams and the Lions and Washington, San Francisco, Green Bay, Chargers, and then Miami with Tua back, like that is a murderer's row. Like you won't find anything, any team facing a schedule like that so far in the year. And so they finally got their break facing a rookie in Caleb Williams, and they attacked them. And we saw they had all those, I don't know, Jude, I think you mentioned, I don't know how many different players got a pressure. Zaven Collins had 3 sacks. I think he had 1 prior to that all season. And it's these guys that you've never heard of. Their entire defensive front is essentially their backups because they're all hurt. They're all on IR. They haven't even had a single snap from their rookie, Darius Robinson, their first-round pick. BJ Ojolari was he was supposed to be their top edge rusher, second-year guy out of LSU, and he got hurt prior to the season, so he's out for the year. Dennis Gardeck, who's essentially a journeyman, who's kind of a high motor guy, he got lost for the year a couple of weeks ago. So they're just doing this with duct tape and no secondary. I mean, you can argue it's the worst talent in the NFL on defense. Actually, I probably wouldn't even argue because I would rather have Jadeveon Clowney over any defensive lineman on Arizona. I'd rather have J.C. Horn over any cornerback on the Panthers. Josie Jewell, Carolina actually has a couple guys who would be the best player outside of Budda Baker maybe on this Cardinals defense. So long story short, I just think that they deserve a lot of credit, just the way that they schemed pressures. They do everything to limit explosive plays. That's the Jonathan Gannon kind of style is keep everything in front and then hope the opposition makes a mistake. And that's what they've done. And now they get a schedule here going forward that's one of the easiest in the NFL. You get a game against Carolina, a game against New England. You've got an opportunity to pick up some wins. And I just think it's a testament to that staff that, taking this team full of nobodies and at least getting them to be competitive and to win games in Miami, San Francisco, and, make it competitive against Detroit and Buffalo, I think is pretty interesting. So, I mean, offensively, they're running the ball well. Kyler Murray's kind of hit or miss. He's had some good games. He's had some struggles. He wasn't good yesterday. Could have had an easy touchdown to Trey McBride at the goal line, for example. And so, winning in spite of that and kind of kicking Chicago's ass, I think was pretty impressive. So are they for real? I'm not sure. I mean, they're playing an easier schedule, so they'll hopefully pick up some wins from their sake. But, they're likely not to be, Super Bowl contenders. But I do think it's pretty interesting for a young team like this to, on the rise, kind of a young, almost like Detroit was a couple of years ago, still, not good enough to really compete for an NFC, but no one really wants to play them right now. So, I don't know if they're for real, but I definitely think they're an interesting team to watch at the end of the season.
Yeah, and absolutely great points about the murderers row they faced. The only team, if they were to face like the Ravens instead of maybe, I don't even know who else, like that in somewhere, that'd be the craziest schedule you could possibly imagine. They have by far faced such a gauntlet of good teams and great quarterbacks. And then we saw Caleb Williams, of course, not be able to perform. And something we're talking about currently is that a lot of that is inflicted on Caleb Williams and his, ability to make pressure for himself, which is obviously not a good trait. And Judah, that's something you were noting, and you have an alternate take on this Cardinals team. Tell me, but based on like what TA just outlined, the murderers row they faced and their ability to, perform well in those games despite the lack of talent, what are you viewing from this Cardinals team? Do you think they're for real?
Yeah, I think it's really a matter of like performing relative to what. And I think if you kind of look at like the Cardinals as the team that's 5-4 and leading the NFC West and saying like, are they real as like division favorites and legitimate NFC playoff team? I think the answer is no. If our expectations are of them as like a frisky team that can possibly make the playoffs, I agree. I think that's true. The case I was making, I think, is that the 5-4 narrative, I think, is like extremely misleading relative to what's actually happened. Like they won 3 games by a combined 4 points against the Niners when the Niners could not kick a field goal, and the Cardinals kind of miraculously or magically came back to win that game. They won a game against the Chargers in which they allowed 400 yards of passing, and they had that really weird Jalen Reagor fumble, somehow pulled that one out. And then we've got like a game against the Dolphins where they're down for the entirety of the second half and then score some last minute points, even though like the defense hasn't been good. And I think you can certainly make a case, and it's reasonable to say that they've kind of faced a gauntlet of opponents. But if you stack it up relative to how those opponents have played against other defenses, the story's not great. Meaning that like the Chargers had one of their highest percentile games. The Dolphins had one of their highest percentile games. The Packers had one of their highest percentile games. So I think the case is a little bit weakened there. But again, it's all relative to the expectations. I think this is a team that if they lose 1 or 2 of those games, that they probably deserve to lose all 3. Honestly, if you want to kind of take like the win probability for most of the game in which they were down and we're on the right side of variance, I think this is a very different narrative if they're a 4-win team or a 3-win team. That's all. I think like, sure, they are coached well. I don't know if like it's hard to quantify these sorts of things. And I think it's almost like an instinct. And I think all of us are prone to this of like, we don't really know where to assign credit or discredit. So like, let's just put it on the coaching staff. And I don't think this is a team that's a serious contender. I think they're probably peaking right now. Maybe they'll be at the benefit of an easy schedule. But I think we know who they are. And that's a team that like, in terms of fundamentals, if we're making like point spreads, are equivalent to a team that's a little bit on the outside looking into the playoff picture. I don't think they're a top 10 team. I don't think there's much to suggest that they are one.
No, very well said. And this week they're going to be, or they currently are, 1.5-point underdogs at home as they host the New York Jets. But at FanDuel Sportsbook, both -108 on the money line in the early market. So we'll see how that develops. And at this point, you could obviously make the case like Judah did, the case that TA did. But at the end of the day, that is why we love the sport of football, because some of these wonky things that happen. And this is your NFC West leading Arizona Cardinals through 9 weeks so far. So definitely deserve some credit for that nonetheless. But let's dive into some more action. We're going to be talking some trade deadline and futures, of course, week 10 openers, and then Monday Night Football. But before we hop into that, we have to shout out our sponsor, FanDuel Sportsbook. Kick off this NFL season with a win on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. It is one of the easiest books for user interface. That's what makes it so easy to use and why people love it across the U.S. Right now, all customers get a profit boost every single NFL week, any single NFL game day. That means you can pump up your gridiron winnings multiple times a week. Tonight, there is a profit boost for Monday Night Football as we have a good game tonight. And FanDuel has a ton of ways for you to get in on the NFL action. You can bet on money lines. You can bet on spreads. You can bet on player props and more. And also with super simple live betting, lightning fast bet settlement, and instant withdrawals, FanDuel makes betting on the NFL easier than ever before. Just visit FanDuel.com/forwardprogress to download FanDuel today. Must be 21 plus and present in select states or 18 plus and present in DC. Opt-in required. Bonuses are issued as non-withdrawable profit boost tokens. Restrictions apply, including token expiration. See terms for both offers at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit fanduel.com/RG. Call 1-888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org/chat in Connecticut or visit mdgamblinghelp.org in Maryland. Hope is here. Visit gamblinghelplinema.org or call 800-327-5050 for 24/7 support in Massachusetts, or call 1-877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY in New York. All right, guys, we already mentioned a trade deadline move that just happened about an hour ago. Of course, there are other teams that are going to look to get active in the market. We have 12 teams at this point with 3 wins. So I'm sure we have a bunch of sellers in the NFL, and some teams like Washington, maybe even Arizona, as we saw, we're just a buyer there, and other teams, of course, that want to fill some needs to try to really make a run. Tia, I feel like this is certainly in your wheelhouse, so I'm going to start with you. Talk about some interesting names and teams that you think are going to be active over over the next 24 hours?
Yeah, man, I think one has been talked about a lot. I think Zadarius Smith from the Browns to Detroit just makes too much sense not to happen, today or tomorrow. So I would expect that. I mean, the Browns are going into a bye. They're clear sellers. There's probably a bunch of guys besides Smith on the roster that they can trade. I heard David Njoku's name out there, even like Greg Newsome, or even I think like an Elijah Moore going somewhere that won't cost you anything. I mean, he's not a great receiver, but if you can send him to a team like Houston, maybe that, I think they're getting back Nico Collins, and after Collins and Dell, it's a huge drop off between those guys and guys like Xavier Hutchinson and John Mechie, who, are more like number 5 and 6 guys. Like they just have not stepped up at all. Don't create much separation. So I think that a guy like Elijah Moore could be, a possibility for a team like Houston. I think Zadarius Smith, like I said, to the Lions. I know Suma and I talked about, I mentioned Evan Ingram, I think last week, as a guy that is just a nice weapon for a potential playoff team, maybe the Chargers, someone like that. So I think there are some guys out there, and, I'm curious. It sounds like, there's going to be a lot of sellers. The fact that this is the first year that the trade deadline was pushed back a week, which I think helps things because there's a lot more teams completely out of it. There's such a big separator between teams that are, making a playoff push and teams that are completely out of it, that I think it will cause some teams to be sellers that maybe in other years, if it was a week prior, that it may not have been, to that degree. So I even think like a guy like Jadeveon Clowney, by the way, is another one. Arden Key, 2 pass rushers who I think will have some value. So I do think we'll see a significant amount of movement. It feels like the trades have increased just generally in the NFL versus past years, where it's turning more into like the NBA and Major League Baseball than it has been in the past. So I do think it'll be pretty interesting.
Certainly. Tia, based on that analysis there, is there any future bets you're looking to make to get ahead of a potential move in the market predicated on a team buying or selling? Or at this point, considering everything, you're still kind of in a wait and see mode?
Yeah, I don't think that really in-season NFL trades usually don't move the needle to that degree where, you're making decisions on futures based on that. Like there's just it's hard, guys aren't being traded that are, elite level talents. So you're just getting kind of guys to fill holes and can help out on the fringes. So nothing from a futures perspective that I think is, worth getting in front of from this. But I do know that I'm probably not, backing any really bad teams that could be sellers right now on a Monday or even early Tuesday before the deadline in terms of this week. You don't want to jump ahead of a bad team that ends up selling off a couple pieces, and kind of like Washington did last year when they traded Sweat and then I think Chase Young the next week. That you don't want to be in front of that, so you might as well just wait from that perspective. But otherwise, I'm not doing anything in that regard.
Very well said. Very well said. Suma, Tia mentioned that you guys were chopping up a little bit off air about what you were thinking about. Tia, of course, just mentioned a bunch of different names. And like Tia mentioned, you're not going to see like a Mike Tannenbaum trade on ESPN where you're getting 3 first-round picks, Jahmyr Gibbs in the second to Detroit for the Lions from the former Jets GM there. But any names that Tia did not mention there that you have your eye on in the trade deadline market?
I think he already mentioned a bunch. Also, Darius Slayton, Giants, Aziz Ojulari, obviously. Those could be guys. Saints, any cornerback, maybe, because their season is also likely over. Kyle Duggar was mentioned over the weekend, but I also think there were some beat reporters indicating that he will not get moved. Actually, I looked at the draft order and I saw, okay, the Raiders might be sellers, but who is there to be sold? Like, all the good guys have like serious contracts and you probably won't move them, like Colt Miller. But outside of that, I mean, who is actually, or who could be available on the Raiders who might get traded, but who is actually really good to help some playoff contending teams out? I don't really know. DA mentioned it, Evan Ingram to the Chargers would be my dream case scenario for the Bolts. They desperately need someone. Hunter Henry might also get moved, And yeah, Arden Key, I would be surprised if he's still on the Titans tomorrow.
I'm hearing a bunch of future Washington Commanders is all I know, hopefully, as a fan. Of course, team has a lot of money to spend, and it's very much a Commanders Twitter thing, but a lot of love for maybe a Max Crosby deal. Obviously, I'd love that. Things have to happen. I hear the chuckles from the guys. That's definitely fan spoken. That's nothing official, of course, but I could dream as this team, of course, is taking a very nuanced approach to team building and has some cap to spend, so we'll figure that out. But Jude, I have to end with you because you always have a unique perspective on these kinds of things. I know Suma and TA mentioned a bunch of veterans, and like we've talked about, we're not normally seeing like real big contributors being moved now. Any sneaky guys you think that could help, or did the guys pick up most of the key pieces you were looking at?
I think the guys picked up key pieces. And the other part is like we've had a lot of trade deadline or pre-trade deadline moves, I guess, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Sumo was talking about the Raiders, who's there to sell off. Like we already saw Devontae Adams trade. We already saw an Amari Cooper trade. We already saw Deontay Johnson trade. I think a lot of the markets kind of settled. We already saw DeAndre Hopkins trade. And I think that also when you think about like what pieces are available to be sold, there are certain positions that are more likely to be traded than others, right? Like wide receiver, I think is one where you can kind of ease a guy in, have him run a bunch of routes, and like that is different than obviously quarterback, which would have the most influence over the course of the game. But like a person's not just going to come in and learn the playbook unless they're Baker Mayfield on the Rams. I just think that most of the action I think we already saw. I don't think there's anything too sneaky that's going to come.
You know what's funny? Like Carolina's going to Germany this week. I don't know when they're leaving, but you know, I'm sure they would have to clearly have to make a trade and not guys like Clowney or Thielen. You know, they can't get on that plane if it's I don't even know if they're going early week or not, but you know, that's kind of interesting is that if they're going to be traded, you know, they're not going to fly out to Germany and then get dealt and come right back. So likely to happen earlier than later. But yeah, I mean, I agree. I think there's a lot of the big names are probably already gone, but you know, there could be these ancillary names. I just find there's no way that Detroit's not going to add a pass rusher. You know, at this point, I think that's kind of a foregone conclusion. It's just a matter of when. So that's probably the one that I'm most confident on. But otherwise, yeah, it could be up for grabs.
Certainly, well said, everybody. To you know, put in perspective, we have been seeing a bunch of trades. So I don't know if we're expecting like an NBA style deadline, even though we have noticed an increase of trades where we're going to see some crazy pieces being moved. Definitely some, like you said, ancillary pieces going. But let's talk about some Week 10 because obviously, like we mentioned, it's early in the market. We don't want to be backing some bad teams who could be trading some players. But of course, there are some good games to note in that regard, and also just some good games in general. Before we get into Week 10, I got to ask again to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Do amazing content all week long, and the likes really help us grow. So please hit that like button if you have not done so already. But Tia, we're going right back to you. Cincinnati, Baltimore. Ravens laying 6.5 at home. We saw that game shook out earlier in the season where the Ravens, I guess you could say, stole a win in Cincinnati based on how that game, you know, ended up finalizing, though it was a great competitive game. Yeah, do you think that this is a game where the market's going to hit 7, considering, of course, the implications for how big of a game this is, or you think that this number has a better chance of creeping down toward 6, etc.?
No, I don't think it would get to 7, but you never know. You know, we'll see what happens with T. Higgins. It's obviously a big needle mover for the Bengals. I'm more interested in this total because it's just like, who's taking the under here? I'm not saying you necessarily have to back the over because the number has moved. I think it's at 53 now. I looked at the close a couple of weeks ago with Higgins in the lineup. It was 48.5, and that obviously flew over. Both of these teams are clear over teams, not stopping each other. You have a Cincinnati offense that is, I think, 1 or 2 in neutral game pass rate, and you've got Baltimore pass defense, which teams have thrown on in neutral situations at the highest rate in the NFL, and there's no reason that's going to be any different. I mean, I expect Burrow to, his passing attempt prop should be, you never see 40, but like literally it should be creeping up to 40. Because that's just like 90% of the games that these two teams have played against each other that he's finished is his pass attempts are clearing the total. So I think there's gonna be a ton of points. I'm not sure how Thursday night plays into that, if it's actually an advantage for the offense. I mean, these teams know each other, but that total I think is really interesting because I think they're both clear overs, and it should be a nice shootout, and I think you would lean Cincinnati's way. But, it's hard to step in front of that train because I know Cincinnati can't stop them either. But I just think of, for a Thursday night game, that's as good as you can get, and it should be a lot of points. So I'm paying attention to that total to see how high it can get, because it's a rather big adjustment in, a month, about 4 or 5 points here, but I think it's well deserved. So that's one that I'm keeping an eye on.
Yeah, very interesting, and certainly worth keeping an eye on for a fun Thursday night matchup that, of course, on the channel we will be breaking down. So make sure you hit that subscribe button. But Suma, we were talking about potential Evan Ingram trades, potential other things the Jacksonville Jaguars as a dead team walking might do. Now they host the Minnesota Vikings in this one. The Jaguars getting 4.5 at home. Vikings coming off a Sunday night win against the Colts as well as a cover. What do you think is going to happen with this market, Suma? Do you think, we've already, again, seen Jacksonville make some trades. We know that they're injured. We know they almost got Nick Sirianni fired yesterday, but were capable of doing so by pulling off that upset. Minnesota, Jacksonville, talk to us about this opener and what you're expecting.
Yeah, I think that the spread is in the right ballpark, but I would guess that if you have any edge on Minnesota, it might probably not the worst idea to grab them, considering the Jaguars might be sellers tomorrow or until tomorrow. Brandon Scherf is a trade candidate. We said it. Evan Ingram, maybe someone on defense. Their offense is already banked up, so I think when it comes to trades and injuries, upside is clearly with the Vikings here. So considering this game is in the correct ballpark, I would probably rather lean towards Vikings catching money after something happens until tomorrow, rather than the Jaguars. So early week arrow might point towards the Vikings.
Gotcha. We're going to stick with you as we continue on here, Suma. We have the Buccaneers getting 6.5 at home against Niners. Of course, Tampa plays tonight in Kansas City, so we could see market adjustments from that simply based on what happens tonight. And, of course, obviously, injuries, unfortunately, can occur in this game, too. That will move this number. But this caught your eye already pre the Tampa Bay Buccaneers game tonight. What are you seeing, or what do you expect from this game in terms of the market for week 10, Suma?
Yeah, the Bucs could still have some injuries tonight, or they could be really, or they could look really, really bad tonight. And the Niners are getting healthy. Christian McCaffrey is coming off IR. Joan Jennings is likely going to back from his hand injury. Deebo Samuel left with a rib injury, likely to be cleared after 2 weeks. So the 49ers offense outside of Brandon Ayuk is dangerously coming back towards full health status. So this should likely explain the number, the early number being close towards -7, and whatever happens tonight might also have some impact on that tomorrow.
Certainly, and like we've talked about earlier in this show a couple of weeks ago about how the 49ers red zone numbers were bad, because yes, you can, I guess, make up for McCaffrey in terms of getting yards, but when it comes down to scoring the football, he's obviously as good as it gets as a weapon. So of course, huge re-addition to this team coming off injury would be the great Christian McCaffrey. But let's go to you, Judah. We're talking about the Steelers and the Commanders. Washington currently laying 2.5 at home. The 4-0 at home Washington Commanders. Let's go. Obviously, Russell Wilson has been playing well for Pittsburgh, but they did play again a Jets team and a Giants team. Commanders at this point are one of your darlings as well, which makes me happy knowing that a guy like you is fully bought into my squad, and have to not be. But what do you expect from this market? Do you think this gets to 3? And if so, are you leaning Pittsburgh, or do you think this one's going to be closer to a PK as, again, Washington and Pittsburgh, both teams that are definitely potential teams to make a move in the next 24 hours?
Yeah, I think this, obviously, barring any kind of major trade news, which I think would be pretty unexpected, I think the number stays around where it's at right now. And I think this is kind of one of the more interesting games to handicap, just because you have major questions about the directions of each of these teams, which is how good is Washington actually? Or are they the number 2 offense in football? I'd even argue potentially number 1 offense in football, in which case this game is probably mispriced at home. And on the other side, it's what are the Steelers with Russell Wilson? Is this kind of a late career emergence that we've seen the last 2 games? Was it just he hit on kind of the 90th percentile of his distribution, and he's going to revert to the player we saw effectively the last 3 years. So I think there are a lot of kind of questions. And what I think is pretty clear about this game is that if we are to replay this game, in theory, in 6 weeks from now, the price is going to look very different, which certainly for me lends itself to kind of a tails play, just because we're going to learn, I think, some critical information. And in many ways, it's very rare we get to see a game in week 10 that I think kind of resembles the same structure of like a game that is to be played in week 1 or week 2 when we're still in kind of the information discovery process. So I think this game kind of stays where it's at, but it's certainly one I'm going to be looking at later in the week.
Love to hear that. And T, I know you have some thoughts on this as well. Do you agree with Judah that this is a very discovery game, or are you currently looking at this number like something's, maybe a little bit off one way or another, where you're interested to see how this market develops, T?
No, I think Washington's undervalued. I think that, Judah's done a nice job the last few weeks talking about it. I think the market if you look at just some of the current market ratings out there, it's just they continue to be undervalued and they continue to cover. So, I think that's, that could be the case here. Pittsburgh is not, who has Pittsburgh faced? Like, what quarterbacks have they faced in the last couple of months that you feel good about in terms of, have they been tested? They haven't face anybody anywhere near the level of Jaden Daniels. So I think that's going to be interesting. I don't know. I don't have a strong opinion right now. I would lean to Washington at under a field goal. But, it's just hard to quantify Mike Tomlin in Pittsburgh. It's always one of those things that you're kind of have to hold your nose, even if you think you have good value, just because they somehow find ways to pull it out. But I do think from a pure ratings perspective, I have Washington. This is essentially telling us that Washington's barely higher rated than Pittsburgh. And I just don't think that's the case. I think they're a much better team, especially the way their defense has been playing better as of late. So, I would lean Washington's way, but it's not something that I'm taking just yet. So I have to do a little bit more work on it.
Of course, definitely time to finalize opinions and see what's going on. Obviously, injuries pop up here and there on the practice reports, all things interesting and things that are noteworthy prior to, getting in. Obviously, there is value in getting into some games as early as now or earlier in the day on a Monday, but other times sitting and waiting, nothing wrong with that. But last but not least for this, before we get into Monday Night Football and break down this massive game, we have, of course, the SGP coming from Judah on this KC Tampa Bay game. But let's talk about the Houston Texans, Detroit Lions. We mentioned how the Texans, this is a Sunday night game, by the way. We've mentioned how the Texans, of course, their offensive line and just the receiver core has let down this team. Obviously, injuries were a big part of that. Receiver core not working out well. And we've already talked about how the Lions are an absolute wagon. And, of course, Goff is now going to be back in the dome in Houston, not his dome, but still in a dome where he's done a lot better. But, Tia, we're going to go right back to you. Lions, Texans getting 3 at home right now. Thoughts on this opening line?
I just thought it was interesting. Just looks like an avalanche of Houston money at the open. It was I saw 4.5. I think last night. It's down to 3. So clearly there's a lot of money backing Houston, which I think at some point Detroit gets inflated, but they just keep meeting and exceeding expectations. So it's hard to step in front of that train. I think clearly it's Houston is the right side at 4.5, but at 3, this is likely a good number, and that's assuming Nico Collins plays, which I don't know. It didn't sound like I didn't hear the tenor of it, but D'Amico Ryan saying that he should. I guess I don't know if he says he expects him to play or we'll see where it goes, but it didn't sound like he's 100% back. So that one is going to definitely move off of that 3 if he doesn't, if he's not playing. They'll probably get back to the, it's a 4 or so, I would guess 3.5, 4. But yeah, I just thought the movement was interesting because stepping in front of that Detroit train is interesting. But they do have some issues on defense, and if you can't get a pass rush against Stroud, he should be able to pick them apart with Nico Collins back. So I think talk about some good primetime games between Cincinnati, Baltimore, and Detroit, Houston. You got a couple of really good ones. So, at some point, Detroit's going to have, Jared Goff is going to, throw an interception or 2, and they're just going to have an off game. It just hasn't happened yet, to their credit. So, but, that was just interesting to me, just the line move initially. Just like said, that all the money came in on Houston right away to get that down to 3.
Certainly. And like you mentioned, some great primetime games this week and some other fun matchups. Glad we were able to get to a couple of them. But let's talk about the pressing primetime game, the one we have tonight, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers heading into Kansas City, taking on the Chiefs. And of course, we're, know how the Buccaneers are doing injured, and their wide receiver core is very banged up as well. Total of 45.5. So, but you mentioned you don't have a ton of thoughts, but I will start with you here on this Buccaneers Chiefs game. Anything to add just from a potential spot you want to look at? Obviously, no need to put any plays out there or anything like that. But what are your just general thoughts on this Buccaneers Chiefs matchup?
My only thoughts are that I'm struggling to imagine how the Bucs are going to score a lot of points in this one. Mike Evans and Chris Godwin have really been big-time losses, obviously. They were able to move the ball quite well against a Falcons defense without a pass rush, basically, because Liam Cohen has also done a phenomenal job of scheming stuff like screen game has been phenomenal. Baker has a really high efficiency on these low A-dot targets, which helped them a lot. But I'm not sure that this is the great recipe to beat that Steve Spagnuolo defense on the road at Arrowhead. I think that without the threat of Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, they can really sit on everything underneath. Their pass rush should get home a lot in this one. So just really struggling how the Bucs are going to score a bunch of points. I think the spread is very likely in the current ballpark. I'm also around 9 with this one. No bet for me, but certainly an interesting game to watch tomorrow.
Certainly. TA, talk to us. Thoughts on the Buccaneers Chiefs primetime matchup tonight?
Yeah, the only thing I have, it won't help anybody, but I have Chiefs on second end of teasers that I'm closing. So at 2.5. So just banking on the typical Kansas City, just, kind of automatic wins in a situation like this against an inferior opponent. And Suma highlighted a lot of the same things that I was thinking. Just it's going to be hard for Tampa to move the ball against the Spags defense. Weather looks pretty bad. Looks like there's going to be a lot of rain, which doesn't help things for Tampa. But last week they did move the ball against that Atlanta defense that somehow didn't realize that they were going to attack them, through tight ends and running backs, which that they did. They just kept going after them in the middle of the field. But I think Kansas City will be ready for it, and Spags is ready for it. So I do think it'll be hard for Tampa to keep up here. I'm not thinking that. If the weather was a little better, you'd feel better about the Kansas City offense maybe being able to explode here. But, down the field with Xavier Worthy and Hopkins. But I do think they do enough to win. And that's about it for me on that front. I think you'll probably see another 20-plus carries from Kareem Hunt, and they kind of get out with a win. So just like I said, just the second end of teasers for me. But I want to see how you never know with weather and with rain, you could get some fluky turnovers and keep Tampa in it. But outside of that, I think it's, clearly Kansas City's to lose.
Definitely. And Kansas City to close out a great week for you this past week, TA. Judah, the one person who has to make a play on this one, talk to us about what tail outcomes you're targeting for a same game parlay between the Buccaneers and Chiefs.
Yeah, so I think there are kind of two general approaches I'd use with parlays. One is to tell a particular story and kind of layer on second and third order effects. Another one is just to basically take a bunch of props that I like and kind of think are not correlated to each other, but it's less so driven from a particular story and more so driven from particular takes that I do think kind of plays in with the story. So I think here the game script I'm betting on effectively is the Buccaneers' ability to move the ball, but not necessarily score a ton of points. That's kind of one angle to it. And the second is the Chiefs' rushing offense, which has done a terrific job, and everyone's kind of talked about the success rate. They're number one in success rate, but also somehow have an extremely low rush explosive play rate. There's a great chart of Kareem Hunt and his stuff rate relative to his explosive rate, and he is a complete outlier with an extremely low explosive rate and an extremely high not getting stuff rate effectively. So I think that kind of is fragile to begin with. I don't think that's the sort of thing that sustains itself over the course of time. And the Tampa Bay rush defense has some massive splits depending on if Vita Vea is playing or not. I think this is actually a particularly tough unit to run against, and I think we should have a pretty strong prior, considering how long the Todd Bowles defense and a lot of rush defense is schematic, how good they've been for a bunch of years. So I think that even if Kansas City is playing from ahead, I think a lot of that is a function of, or could be a function of, I should say, Mahomes is passing and less so Kareem Hunt. You're just not going to get 25 carries if you're not converting as high a rate of first downs as they've done in the past. So that, of course, is all projected into, I should say, that is all projected into kind of medians that are driving the pricing now. So I think we start with a Chiefs. I did minus 8.5 here, even though minus 9.5 works. We're just the prices on FanDuel are effectively the same as we build out the rest of this parlay, whether they're at 8.5 or 9.5. I have the Chiefs to cover. And I think we see Baker Mayfield. You don't run on the Chiefs with the you don't generally want to kind of just like take out a valuable data point. But I don't think Lamar Jackson's rush yards are anything like what Tampa Bay and their run game is going to look like. And Kansas City is by far number one in all rush metrics if you kind of take out that Lamar Jackson run game. Even if you want to just say like design rushes by running backs, this is a Chiefs team that is like 5% better than the next closest team in terms of success rate and EPA allowed. You do not run on this team. And Tampa Bay is more than happy to utilize the short passing game, throw the ball 45, 50 times with Baker Mayfield. They also do target their running backs and tight ends, which has been a schematic problem for the Chiefs for a long time. So I think we see a Chiefs minus 8.5 cover the spread. Baker Mayfield to throw for 300 yards. I think that happens on volume. I think they control a lot of the ball here. Kareem Hunt under 63.5. We'll get a nice inverse correlation there with the Chiefs spread. Again, I think this has to do with Patrick Mahomes. And then kind of one other additional prop that I like, given that I think that Kansas City is going to be a little bit pass heavier, is Noah Gray, alt receiving yards, where he has seen a huge increase in snaps over the last couple of weeks. He also, now that Rashee Rice is hurt, is has the highest targets per route run versus zone, which is almost exclusively what Tampa Bay runs. He also has the highest targets per route run on the team when blitzed. So his snap share is increasing. His rate of targets has always been high, but because the snap share is increasing, that's going to lead to more absolute targets going up against a Tampa Bay defense that is allowing a ton of protection to opposing tight ends. So we kind of got a little bit of a mix of a story and also just a bunch of props that I like. And our final build here will be Kareem Hunt under 64.5 rush yards now. Chiefs minus 8.5. Noah Gray 40 receiving yards. And Baker Mayfield to throw for 300 yards, banking on some garbage time here. Not the highest conviction of SGPs, but value is value, and we're gonna try and bank on a long one tonight.
Value's value, 90-1. Of course, you know what you're playing in a game when you have a 90-1 parlay. Obviously, not sitting there expecting that to cash. A couple of dollars on that and have a good time and enjoy this game. And I hope that you guys enjoyed our breakdown of the takeaways week 9, of course, the trade deadline, and some week 10. It was a pleasure to have you guys. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel so you can get involved in the comments. And also, we have content on this YouTube channel all week long, breaking down best bets on Wednesdays, prop bets on Thursdays, and live watch-alongs with Rob Pizzola and special guests every single primetime game. So make sure you don't miss out on that. Thank you for everybody for tuning in. Thank you to the panelists, and we'll see you guys next week. Best of luck with your wagers tonight.